May the words of my mouth and the meditations on all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you, O God, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I want to just take a moment and imagine yourself 5 years in the past. So think about in 2010 who you were. What made up your day-to-day life? Work, worship, relationships, and how did you feel about your life? So what if I had come to you in 2010 and told you what your life would be like today in 2015? How would 2015 seem to your 2010 self? Scary? Exciting? Unexpected? So as we think about this idea of looking forward and thinking about what 2020 and 2030 is going to look like for us, this is this process of vision. It's this idea of peering into the unknown to discern what our current commitments and direction should be. This process can be pretty overwhelming. We go through the process of discernment because vision opens us up to all of these possibilities that are before us. And when we look into the future and we start to see where our lives could be, we start to kind of take stock of what the journey between where we are now and where we could be, what that journey is going to require of us. And often the excitement and passion that envisioning the future can give us can be overshadowed and crowded out with doubt and fear. Because it's too hard to think that that's where our lives could be. Or I don't deal well with change. I'd rather things just kind of stay the same. Or I'm not really smart enough for that career. Or I'm not really attracted to women. Or my partner would never let me do that. So as we start to envision all these possibilities that are before us, a lot of times all we can see are obstacles. And it's almost like we excuse ourselves out of our own future because it's too hard. So what if the current version of yourself was to write a letter to your former self? What would it say? What would you say to your 2010 self? Your 2005 self? And if you got a letter today from yourself in 2020 or 2030, how would that impact your current decisions and how you live your life? So the reality is vision doesn't really work that way. We don't really get this clear shot and this full view of the future all at once. It's this journey that we go through that unfolds before us, and it's impacted by circumstances we can't control, and then also by decisions that we make. And every twist and turn leads us toward our destination. And most often, where the journey leads us is someplace unexpected. It could even be shocking. The man in our story today from the scripture, he encountered an unexpected and shocking left turn in his journey. So the text we read focuses on Saul's restored vision. But I want to kind of zoom out and look at the circumstances and Saul's life to kind of get an idea of what led up to Saul's encounter with Ananias, and then also why it was so unexpected and shocking. So the story that we find is in the book of Acts, which is the second part of a story between Luke and Acts that kind of gives us this idea of Jesus' life and then the start of the early church and how those come together. So it gives us this narrative that connecting these two things, Jesus' life and the beginning of the church. And the author is Luke. And Luke also kind of it seems as though he's trying to give some legitimacy to Saul, who would eventually become Paul, and would help spread early Christianity. So Luke seems to have kind of a particular lens that he would like you to see Paul through. And the reason that I kind of think that is because the Paul that's depicted later on in the New Testament is a little different than some of the things that we read about Paul in the book of Acts. So Luke chronicles Paul's ministry life, and Saul, as he starts out, makes his first appearance during Luke's depiction of a murder of a man named Stephen. Stephen was killed by a mob of people who were angry with him for his beliefs about Jesus as the Messiah. And so they threw stones at him until he died. And to do this, they took off their coats and they laid them in a pile at the feet of a man named Saul. So violence and hatred seem to be a theme in Saul's life. First, he witnesses this violence and is complicit in it, in his witness. And then he inflicts it on others. And then eventually, violence would take Paul's life when he was murdered by the Roman Empire. So where was God in the midst of Saul's hatred and violence? Where was God when Saul became this powerful, zealous, religious fundamentalist? Where was God when Saul began to imprison and oppress Christians in Jerusalem? So in the story, we see God show up in a very vivid way in Saul's journey. So after Saul begins to oppress Christians in Jerusalem, a funny thing happens. All of those Christians who are in Jerusalem flee to the outlying areas, and with them, they take their gospel message. So that oppression actually had the opposite effect of what he had intended. And so he made his way toward Damascus to follow up with these Christians that he had been oppressing. And he had paperwork with him to imprison anyone that he saw fit. And then God shows up. God appears to Saul on the road. And when God shows up in this way, in this kind of really direct interaction with people in the Bible, there's a word for that. We call it a theophany. A theophany. So Saul hears the voice of Jesus and the light of God and goes blind because of it. And we see this story depicted in the beginning of chapter 9, but there are two other depictions of this later on in the book of Acts. So this one in chapter 9 is kind of a third-person narrative about this happened to Saul, but the other two are actually first-hand accounts when Saul is giving a testimony, first to an angry Jewish mob, and then also to Roman authorities. And in the third depiction of it, in the book of, in Acts 26, this is what Paul said that he heard. When we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads." What in the world does that mean? So apparently, this kicking against the goads is actually would have made sense to first century Jewish Christians who read this, because there was this Greek proverb that was about the futility of trying to push back against the divine will. So a goad was this long pointed stick that you would poke cattle with to get them to go where it is that you wanted them to go. So Saul was pushing back on God's prodding. So we see this clue about where God was in the midst of Saul's hatred and violence, that God was prodding Saul, and that Saul's reaction was to push back with hatred and fear. So God was nudging Saul toward this vision that Saul couldn't accept. There is a Catholic theologian named Murphy O'Connor who said that Saul was an immature religious bigot working out his personal problems. And I don't think he's wrong. I think that Saul's fear of the fulfillment of this vision is what fueled his zealous fundamentalism and hatred. In fact, I'll take that a step further and say that I actually believe that fear is the fuel that feeds all fundamentalism, including the fundamentalism that we see in Christianity today. And I say that as someone who comes from fundamentalism. I know what that fear looks like and what it tastes like and how it infiltrates everything. And I also say that as someone who loves and grieves for people that I know. that are still trapped in those cycles of fear and fundamentalism and self-hatred and then hatred of others.
Amen.
James Baldwin said, "I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once the hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." So when I read this story, I see that. I see how fundamentalism is a fearful reaction to God's prodding. So how did God reach Saul? And how can that inform our interactions with modern fundamentalist Christians that we interact with? Because we all have those interactions. Notice that God doesn't use well-formed arguments to change Saul's mind. Okay? Right. So changing Saul's mind seems to be pretty low on the priority list. God uses Saul's body to send a message by blinding him. And then God uses relationship to open Saul's eyes to the vision that God wanted him to see. So when Ananias is called to reach Saul, he isn't asked to bring well-formed arguments with him to convince Saul to leave fear and embrace love. Ananias' job wasn't to prove that Saul was wrong. He was called to prove that Saul was loved. So the next time there's a fundamentalist up in your face, up in your Facebook newsfeed, or at your Thanksgiving dinner table, remember, it is not your job to prove them wrong. It is to prove that they are loved. Yes, Tom, you do. Because God says so. So sometimes that love looks like firm boundaries, or questioning and leaning in to open up dialogue, or finding ways to stay in relationship with them if it is possible and healthy for you. That love doesn't always look like just sitting back and taking it. That love can look like a lot of things. But you have this opportunity to prove that they are loved, like Ananias embodied radical love. It wasn't Saul's mind that was changed, just by some really well-formed arguments and logic. It was an encounter with the divine, an encounter with embodied radical love, and Ananias coming to him and laying hands on him and freeing him so that he could embrace the vision that God had for him. So God still uses relationships to open us up to vision. Because even if we aren't fundamentalists, we're still really good at tunnel vision and only seeing what we want to see. And we all have the opportunity to lean further into fear and further away from love. So God uses relationships and encounters, divine encounters, and prodding to get us toward the fulfillment of this vision. And that prodding process, some people call that calling, that God is calling us. So what is it that God is calling you toward? And what is it that God is calling us collectively toward? And how do we determine what that is? That's what this discernment process that we've been going through as a faith community is supposed to help us do. But there are three certain things that I think could help us in discernment. And the first one is to notice God's prodding. To notice when God is pushing us toward or calling us towards something in particular. And notice that in your heart and in your body. Take time to be still and to listen to those things. I always feel like my brain is the last to know. Most of the time, my heart and my body and my spirit know way before my brain has caught up. But the difference is I've been conditioned to not pay attention to those things or to trust them. Trust in your ability to discern God's prodding in your life. Second of all, relationships are key to the process of discernment. Saul was able to discern the vision that God had for Paul as a missionary, as a person who helped start the church because of relationship that started with Ananias coming to him. That's why, as we're going through this process of discernment as a faith community, we're doing it in small groups to build relationships. And this idea of relationship is the reason why, to determine the direction of our church, Tom Ott didn't go on a 90-day vision quest and then come back to tell us what the vision of the church would be. Because that's not discernment in relationship and in community. And that's also why conversations and interactions help align us spiritually and physically and emotionally to receive vision. Whether that's personal vision and discernment or corporate, relationships are key. And the last one is to find ways to be open and not resistant. I heard that growl, Toby. This is not something that happens easily or often. For me especially, I'm more likely to be resistant than I am to be open. I think that was also the case for Saul. So that Saul that received spiritual healing at the hands of Ananias, what if Paul, in later years, had been able to speak with the younger Saul and tell him what his future would hold and to be open to what God was giving him? What do you think Saul would have thought if he had known that he would be a pivotal leader in spreading the gospel that he was hatefully and violently trying to stamp out? Do you think Saul would have believed that? I don't know that he would, because he wasn't open. Saul ignored God's prodding until, well, he couldn't anymore. See, vision is born out of God's radical love. But can I trust that love to guide me? Can I be open to God's love and not resistant to it? So where could God's radical love be leading you? We're going to take a couple minutes to reflect on this. So when you look back at the journey that God has brought you on and all the steps that it took to get from where you were to where you are now, and then think about all of the steps that it may take to get from where you are now to the fulfillment of God's vision for you. Consider. Be open and listen. Because the future you will be surprised by all the steps between where you are now and the fulfillment of God's vision for you. So I want you to take a couple minutes to think about some things, about where God is prodding you. A good idea of where that might be is places where you feel like you want to push back against God's prodding. Think about what relationships you need in your life to help you discern God's vision. And also think about ways that you can find to be open and not resistant.